tired of those political ads? I know I am. And that's because they don't focus on the bigger picture. You know what I mean? I'm talking like questions like, what kind of democracy do we want to be? How can we make a utopia not become a dystopia? How does anyone let a totalitarian government rule? And if you find yourself in one, how do we get out? Should we all become anarchists? That's why I love political science fiction books, because they explore all of these questions and more. Political science fiction is a subgenre of science fiction that examines at its core how individuals, societies, and civilizations are shaped by political decisions. Now, to caveat this list, I have to say that most science fiction has at least a little bit of politics involved. So that means that to qualify for this list, I tried to stick with books whose main theme, main plot, or biggest takeaway deals with political structure or the exploration thereof. Let me know how I did in the comment section down below. Now, the other caveats are that there is only one book per author, there are no personal political views shared in this video, and as usual, this video is approved by Secret Sauce of Storycraft and Pico. This is Pico. Vote for Pico! We have to start with one of the most famous political science fiction books, and that is 1984 by George Orwell. This book is probably one of the most famous extremist totalitarian regimes that rules by fear. And of course, the government's name is Big Brother. This is one of the most culturally relevant science fiction books out there, and I don't think I have to tell you what this book is all about. We of course have many other books that focus on totalitarian regimes. I'm not going to name all of them here, but a lot of them are focusing on a particular aspect of those regimes. So a couple of very famous ones are We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. This one focuses primarily on the individual freedoms that are taken away by the totalitarian regime. Then we have Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This one focuses on the reproductive freedoms that are taken away. We then have Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, where it focuses on censorship by a totalitarian regime. We then have The Hunger Games, which focuses on the enforcement of a totalitarian regime and how they keep power. Now, there are lots of others, but one of the big ones that I have to mention here is also Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Rather than focusing on rule by fear, focuses on ruling by pleasure and apathy of the masses. This is arguably more scary than 1984, and perhaps a little bit more true to reality. And that is why that needs to be on the list. Now let's focus on some non-totalitarian regime books. Let's talk about The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. This is probably the second most famous political science fiction book because it really talks about two distinctive planets who represent capitalism and anarchy/socialism, communism. And these two governments are really compared and contrasted throughout this book, and with the main character who is trying to sell a particular idea to these two societies. But I think this comparison between the two types of government make this story very well balanced, but a little dense to get through. Next on the list is a less well-known book called Floating Worlds by Cecilia Holland. This book focuses on an individual who is kind of voluntold to be on a committee that is trying to negotiate peace between the outer planets. In this future, Earth is an anarchist society. We have the moon, that's a fascist society. We have Mars, that is representative of a capitalist society. And then we have the outer planets that are considered barbarians and very honor and duty bound. And it is the barbarians with which we have to negotiate because their solution to this political conundrum of the solar system is violence. This book is very vaguely reminiscent of Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. So if those of you out there are fans, you might consider picking up Floating Worlds. Next on the list is going to be Jennifer Government by Max Berry. In this book, we have a government that is privatized, which means it is a plutocracy. A plutocracy is a government by the rich. And in this book, we get a lot of exaggeration and satire of the failings of consumerism, especially in our society today. This book has a fun, tongue-in-cheek twist to it, so if you are not somebody who enjoys parodies or satires, this may not be the book that you enjoy most on this list. Then we have the Texcaalan duology. That is Memory Called Empire and Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine. This book features another ambassador who is introduced from an outside society to a Byzantine Aztec combination government. However, one of the things that made this duology make this list for me is the discussion of the nature of power. Just because this particular group happens to have so much power, whether or not they wish to oppress other cultures, they are by understanding the nature that is different power dynamics. And it is that exploration that made this book such an interesting political discussion for me. Then we cannot forget the Centennial Cycle by Malka Older. This is a trilogy that starts with the book Infomocracy. This is a really interesting government because it is called a microdemocracy. In the future, we've gone the other way than totalitarianism, and now we vote on absolutely everything the government does. And it's very decentralized because it is a government of the people. So if you care about an issue, you have to vote. And the government is organized into groups of, I think it's 100,000 people. And basically everything that you vote on is what happens for you. And if you're unhappy with that particular grouping or the outcomes of the vote, then what happens is you move districts so that way you can be happier, maybe living and voting in a different micro-democracy. There is, of course, alternate governments, and every grouping of 100,000 people vote on something different. So some of them have presidents, some of them don't. Some of them have senates, some of them don't. Some of them are any kind of government you can name. And it is a really interesting world and way with which we explore government. If you're interested in political science fiction, this is definitely a trilogy that you cannot miss. The next book on this list is also a powerhouse of political science fiction, and that's going to be Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. Whether you agree with Heinlein or not on his political views doesn't really matter because this book starts so many conversations. In this one, we really get a militaristic meritocracy, meaning that you have to have served in the military to have full voting rights and citizenship. And it is only by the merit of civil service that you can participate in the government of this country. Now, unfortunately, this book doesn't really dive too heavily into the inner workings of the politics there, but it really covers a lot more on the military aspect of this world. There are other Heinlein books out there that will also explore interesting political themes throughout his writing, but I think this one is probably the biggest and most famous of all of his political science fiction. Then we have the book Walkaway by Cory Doctorow. This is a really interesting book about the rise of anarchy and the decentralization of government. In this book, we have a group of young people who are so disgusted with capitalism as it is in the near future that they decide to walk away. And they give up material possessions in order to no longer participate in capitalism. And instead, they become walkaways, and we get to see how their society of anarchy begins to develop throughout the book. This is one that really surprised me because through the characters' dialogue and discussion, they're trying to figure out if something like an anarchy decentralized government would work or not. And what happens in the end is a little bit different than what I expected at the beginning. So If you haven't read this book and you like political sci-fi, this is one that you should consider. The next one on this list is going to be a novella, and that is called January 15th by Rachel Swirsky. In this novella, we only have enough space and time to play with one political idea, and I think it's really interesting. She plays with the idea of universal basic income. In this novella, we follow 4 different females from different socioeconomic backgrounds in a world where universal basic income is the norm. And she really explores the ideas of whether or not it impacts them positively, negatively, or at all in terms of fairness. I thought this book had a very distinctive bias, but it was a really interesting discussion of this particular idea. I also have to warn you that while this one is a really interesting idea, it's probably not the best storytelling I've ever read, if you know what I'm saying. Now we're gonna move on to Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I know a lot of people would be surprised that I'm not including the Mars trilogy here, but I think Ministry for the Future really deals a lot more with the inner workings of the global government as a whole and what it takes to change global government policy as well as cultural ideas and public beliefs. And I think that this book tackles that topic a lot more interestingly. And while I don't 100% agree with everything he includes in this book, I really thought that it was a very thoughtful, very well fleshed out future government that was explored in this book. Next, let's move into a little bit of feudalism with Frank Herbert's Dune series. Now, some books in this series go a lot more into the feudalism than others, but I would be remiss not to include it on this list because there isn't a whole lot of other books that have noble houses and yet they have a background manipulation of a religious order who's manipulating the religious houses and the emperor, and we get to see how all of that impacts individuals as well as we get to see it on a global worldwide scale. There's so much to unpack in the Dune series, and it has to be included as a political science fiction book. However, if you're interested in a little bit of feudalism, but you don't want that religious aspect to it, you can turn to Ian McDonald's Luna trilogy, starting with the book Luna New Moon. This is all about these noble mining families who begin to grow and rule on the moon. And of course, we have a transition of power as this first book opens, and this means that they are vulnerable to take over. This series really gets into the nitty-gritty of power and control, manipulation, and human nature in the very fundamental aspects of politics. That is something that really reflects the feudalistic nature and how that might work on a new planet. So this is one that I would also encourage everyone to pick up if you haven't already. It is really playing with a lot of really interesting political ideas. And that does it for my political science fiction book list today. Please feel free to pick up one of these political science fiction books. And if you have any other political science fiction book ideas that you would like to see on this list or you want to see me read, please link those in the comment section down below, because of course this was not an all-inclusive list. And until next time, you guys, see you in the next video. Vote for Pico!